Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the OSINT Bunker's News Snapshots, our once a fortnight short news podcast bringing you the latest from around the world. I'm joined this evening by George, Allison, and obviously OSINTtechnical, two of my co-hosts here on the podcast. Technical, now that I've interrupted you, would you like to take over?
Now I can lead it. We wanted to touch on a few things this week. I know both George and John have individual stuff they want to touch on. But the main three topics are obviously going to be sort of a carryover, actually, from last week. So, of course, entire Middle East situation, ranging from Yemen to Israel to Gaza to Syria and Iraq. And then we have Ukraine, of course. And then a brief touch on some new UK carrier deployments. It's been a while since we've seen one, and we may see another in the near future. But just leading off Red Sea, obviously, I think, looking at the UK's Maritime Trade Office, which is sort of responsible for officially broadcasting warnings and news of various Houthi attacks on ships in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. We haven't seen any, actually, over this past week. The frequency of attacks has dropped. At the same time, we've seen an increase in US, UK proactive self-defense strikes, hitting Houthi USVs, hitting Houthi anti-ship ballistic missile tells and launch locations. Is this a sign that Operation Prosperity Guardian is working? And is it actually sort of forming results for shipping in the region?
I think the Americans and the British will certainly be hoping that that is what it shows. I think to a certain extent it's probably too early to say. At the end of the day, we have seen a significant amount of shipping has diverted over the last month, of course. And so there is that element where perhaps the Houthis aren't being as successful because there's not quite as many targets as perhaps there was when they started all of this some time ago now. But it's also worth noticing that the Iranian intelligence gathering ship that has been widely speculated to be gathering the information for the Houthis and providing them with the targeting data has been hiding in a Chinese-owned port in Africa for most of the last week. And as a result, it's entirely likely that the Houthis now, due to the strikes on their radar installations and some of their other assets, perhaps don't have as much information as they would like in order to be able to launch such attacks.
And that is interesting because attacks did shift from more the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea into the Gulf of Aden after the Iranian spy ship, which is the Bishad, and I believe it has a corvette escorting it at the moment. But both of those went through the Strait of Hormuz from the Red Sea into the Gulf of Aden, and attacks appeared to sort of shift in line with that. Especially the attack on the Marlin Luanda, which was hit by a Houthi anti-ship ballistic missile, suffered some fairly severe damage, but was fortunately aided by Indian, French, and U.S. ships, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago. But it definitely does seem like potentially the Houthis are getting some very direct targeting information from the Iranians and from that Iranian ship operating in the area.
And as I say, at some point I would imagine that vessel will come back out of port and maybe we'll see an uptick in the attacks on commercial shipping again. But as I say, for the moment I think it's probably too early really to say, although certainly it looks like a positive result at the moment for the US and British strikes.
Yeah, I think it's just a long-term question right now of when shipping companies will be comfortable moving back into the Bab el Mandeb and actually putting shipping traffic back in the area. I'm not sure when that's going to be.
Well, right now, I mean, transits through the Babel Manda, I think it was before the attacks, was about 500 per week. Now we're down to 300, and that's after the naval protection operation started, and that's after the US-UK attack on the Yemen mainland. So whether or not confidence is restored, it seems like that's a long way off.
I mean, it shipping companies will obviously have their own concerns.
Yeah.
Um, and insurance companies as well, because they're the ones that make the real decisions on these issues. And I think at this point we should probably move and touch on Ukraine, which has seen some uh, interesting shakeups over the past 30 or 48, 72 hours in regards to the military command structure with the firing of the Ukrainian commander in chief or of the commander in chief of the armed forces, um, who was sort of not unceremoniously let go, but after weeks of postulation and weeks of rumors and weeks of reports, was finally announced to be departing his post by Zelensky. Um, and there were several other senior membership or senior positions that were also vacated and replaced within the Ukrainian armed forces defense staff. And I think that raises kind of an interesting question of what is Zelensky doing? What is this shift doing to the Ukrainian armed forces? What is the end result of this going to be? Um, Sort of what directions do we go in here?
Yeah, and it's fair to say that the chap who's been dismissed, I can't pronounce his name for the life of me, so I'm not going to try it, but he was generally very well regarded, it seems, among sort of his junior ranks and among the rest of the defence staff. The chap that Zelensky has obviously selected to replace him, seemingly not so much. I've heard a great many people saying that he's not very well respected by the junior ranks, and a lot of people have been suggesting that Zelensky's move here is largely political. That this general was perhaps providing a little bit too much of a sort of celebrity figure within the government, and perhaps Zelensky felt threatened politically as a result of that. Obviously, in times of war, it's hard to say how much of it is political sort of manoeuvrings and how much of it is Zelensky's genuine belief that it was time for someone else to lead the army. Obviously, the Ukrainian military has, for the most part, been in somewhat of a stalemate with the Russian military now for some months, and obviously that is partly down to weather conditions over the winter and also due to just the state of the conflict at this stage. But I think it's hard to say at the minute whether there is sort of a long-term plan for Zelensky behind this manoeuvre, or how much of it is just, as people have been saying, this feeling of a political threat to his leadership.
I mean, obviously, the former commander in chief of Ukrainian armed forces, Ozani, um, and the new one, Sirsky, certainly have what is perceived as different command styles. Now, obviously, we don't know the inner machinations of the Ukrainian armed forces, especially Ukrainian armed force leadership. But the one thing that we do know is their outward perception. And at the end of the day, among the Ukrainian armed forces, the rank and file, lower level officers, there is a perception that Sirsky is a bit more willing to directly obey orders from without sort of comment and without feedback, directly obey orders from political leadership. Um, he is perceived as holding Bakhmut too long. And causing sort of undue Ukrainian casualties as the sort of supply lines collapsed. Um, he's viewed as pushing forward the counteroffensive around Bakhmut over the summer, that just didn't really achieve that much, and was fairly casualty heavy for what it was. Um, I think that that perception alone is probably causing a bit of harm to the Ukrainian armed forces right now, especially as they come into a similar situation in Avdiivka. You're seeing right now what is very much a stressed main supply route and a potential for forces to become encircled and sort of brutal street fighting in the city. And I think that there will continue to be that perception, whether or not he'll directly be responsible for it, of sort of pushing forward heavier casualties or pushing forward more politically expedient ideas without sort of or not necessarily. He definitely understands. I mean, he's a good general. He's been a commander for a while and is generally known to be fairly respected among sort of that group of generals. But it'll be sort of pushing a more politically expedient method of prosecuting the war, and I think that may continue to provide pressure among the rank and file.
Yeah, indeed, and I'm sure that the general that's been dismissed is probably grateful that he's on the Ukrainian side rather than say on the Russian side, given what Putin's been doing with the vast majority of his generals in the last 6 months.
Well, the Ukrainians are getting far more of them than the Russians are getting rid of them. So, if it's a bad general or a bad commander, they're much more likely to die in a HIMARS or a Storm Shadow strike than actually get fired. So, that is the one upside for the Russians, if you can call that the upside to that situation.
And of course, speaking about the Russians, I think it's probably worth just briefly mentioning the interview, if you could call it that, that a certain US member of the press had with Vladimir Putin this week.
Oh Lord. So I watched most of it. It was a slog. I'm gonna be honest with everyone. It was a bit of a rambling history lesson, or not necessarily a history lesson, but a lesson on how Putin views history. It was definitely very pedantic. I saw a few people comment in sort of speaking on how it very much reminded them of long-winded, slightly tipsy conversations from their Russian grandfathers. And I think that's a fairly accurate way of putting it. Putin went to that meeting or that interview, I don't think with any intentions to actually really talk to a U.S. audience. Almost all of that positioning was aimed internally, and frankly, I don't think there's any case where many people who don't have an outward incredibly close interest in the war in the West actually watched it in full, because good Lord, it was hard for me too, and I was actually trying to study what Putin was saying. It was a slog of an interview. And I think that sort of tells us where Putin is at this point, is that one of his main goals is speaking to an internal audience, in that he doesn't really care as much right now about external positioning or external, sort of propaganda. At the moment, he'll rely on other people to touch on that, but his main goal right now is continuing to justify the war as a sort of Russia's historical right. Its goal to retain control over, starting in 828, a historic empire, which has been Putin's view for a while. I mean, his view of Russia is a very imperial one. Both in its underlying nature and its actual operating banner, and historic. He views this as Russia's right. Russia was an empire. Russia will continue to be an empire. He sort of seeks to return that. And I mean, longer term, obviously, Tucker basically went to Russia to have a history lesson recited at him, and get insulted a few times by Putin. Um, but it definitely does reveal sort of where the Russian sort of information environment is at the moment.
Yeah, indeed. And I think with that, we'll move on now to the other major topic that's still sort of in the news, and that would, of course, be the conflict in Gaza. As I understand it this evening, President Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have had a phone call. There's been some interesting sort of backwards and forwards statements from both sides in the last couple of days, with Biden pretty much saying that Israel needs to sort of consider how far it wants to really go with this. I think there was some sort of potential miscommunication where at one point it appeared that Biden was saying that Israel's response to the October 7th attacks was now over the top. It doesn't appear that there's been an official retraction or official clarification of that statement, but it looks like following this evening's phone call they seem to be a little bit more on the same page with each other, with Netanyahu emphasising that they need to continue this fight and that Hamas is very much on its knees, while Biden reiterating that Israel needs to ensure that civilians are being protected and that aid is being supplied to those civilians in Gaza.
Yeah, I definitely think there is a huge aid issue right now. I know there are some very telling satellite images from Maxar that came out. I think it was yesterday, that showed just the sheer size of the refugee camps right now in Rafah. There's an area in the northern part of Rafah city that's just it's effectively become a tent city. There are hundreds of thousands of people sheltering in that area. They're fairly close to the border crossing point with Egypt for aid. It's still fairly far away from current fighting. But at the same time, Israeli forces have announced that they're most likely going to be moving towards that area. So it just becomes even more of a humanitarian nightmare.
Especially when you consider that I think figures are there are 1.5 million Palestinians in Rafah.
Yes, I mean, and the nominal population of Rafah city is 200,000 basically, but before the conflict started, so it's certainly a very large increase.
And Israel has said that it is looking at what options are open in terms of moving the civilian population so that they're out of the combat zone when the push to Rafah does go ahead. It seems more or less a certainty at this point. The IDF are pretty certain that that's their stated aim, that they want to continue their push. But obviously, as Netanyahu said repeatedly, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. We're going to be looking at this conflict for a good few months yet still.
Yeah, I think that, at the moment it's definitely it's a large concern.
And I think one final topic for this evening is obviously going to be the NATO exercise that's coming up. Exercise Steadfast Defender, I think it is. It's going to be one of the largest NATO exercises in the organisation's history. And obviously preparations are well underway. If I recall correctly, there's going to be something in the region of 80,000 personnel from across the alliance involved in this exercise. George, perhaps you'd like to just give us a little bit more on that.
Well, I mean, you went far off. 90,000 from 31 nations, and it's taking place more or less. I could be wrong on this actually, so someone please do correct me. But I think it's mostly. Yeah, so it's most of Europe, the landmass at least. Obviously not every country, but north, south, east, west, that kind of thing. From Norway, Sweden, Finland to Greece, you've obviously Germany, Latvia. I'm just listing European countries at this point, but my sort of thing recently has been the the lack of ability of the UK seemingly to actually send a carrier to this. Now, many listeners may or may not be aware that HMS Queen Elizabeth was to lead quite a sizable portion of the maritime assets in this exercise. It obviously didn't, because it failed to deploy. HMS Prince of Wales was due to take over today, or rather it was due to sail today, and it didn't. So if you are listening to this, take a seat, because I know the news that British carrier failed to deploy. It will probably, startle you. It will be so unexpected that it will shock you. But no, that is now 2 carriers failed to deploy. Now, guys, on it, this little bit we need to cut. My Alexa's just started talking. I'm so sorry. Yeah. So back to what I was saying. Where was I with that? Yeah. So HMS Prince of Wales was due to sail today. No reason has actually been given as to why the vessel didn't. I've heard multiple reasons, but be it logistics related, be it wind related. The Ministry of Defence hasn't actually given an official line on this, which is pretty unusual, because they usually try to head off any sort of speculation. They never go into specifics, but they will, give a general sort of idea. Now, some people listening might think, well, why should they tell you about the fleet? That's a question I'm asked quite a lot, and I suppose I'd answer that with, we do live in a democracy. We do live in a society in which these things should be somewhat transparent. But I think I'm just rambling at this point. But hopefully HMS Prince of Wales will sail tomorrow. I think I heard probably tomorrow afternoon. It was maybe just a 24-hour sort of issue. But all that being said, the ship was on 30 days' notice to sail. Achieving the ability to sail in 8 days is a remarkable testament to the capabilities of the Royal Navy and the ship's crew. But this is a wee bit far off the topic. Well, no, not entirely too far. Steadfast Defender. It's going to be huge. It's going to be very interesting. And really, I think I'm going to cut my rambling short on that.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are all done for this episode. So, thank you very much for listening. We will be back with another new Snapshots episode in about 2 weeks' time. And you can always catch the rest of the OSINT Bunker podcast via our website, www.theosintbunker.org, or find us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the other platforms.